So, good morning, everyone, and welcome to another Sunday session with HGP, the Humanists of Greater Portland. My name is Anand Atre, and it is my pleasure and privilege to be your MC for today's event, which is being recorded for the general public. HGP believes strongly in the freedom of speech, but I must state that the views expressed by myself, our reader, today's speaker, HGP members, and our guests at today's meeting are not the official views of the Humanists of Greater Portland. For those who are new to humanism or HGP, humanism represents a progressive way of thinking that is informed by science, inspired by art, and motivated by compassion. A humanistic approach to life is grounded in reason and our shared humanity, making a humanistic lifestyle one that aligns with social and planetary responsibility. Humanistic values are not based on appeals to external deities. Instead, they are formed when humans use reason and reflect with empathy on our experiences, collective needs, and capacity for flourishing. Paramount among these values is the commitment to uphold the dignity of all human beings. For now, though, without further ado, let me turn the proceedings over to our reader for this week, Doug Matheson.
I found myself wanting to share the whole last chapter of Jesse Baring's The Belief Instinct, but that would have been north of a 10-minute reading. So I tried to carefully select sentences and paragraphs to share with you. I hope the thought flow still flows. The atheist may or may not come to God, quotation marks, when things appear most grim, but that doesn't mean he or she is in any way confirming God's existence. Even an atheist coming to confess ignorance and acknowledging God's existence during difficult times would have zero to do with whether or not that God actually exists. I, for one, don't handle suffering very well. Having a low-grade fever and a sore throat is enough to have me privately asking God why he's being so unspeakably cruel to me. As we've seen throughout this book, our private experiences generated by thinking about our individual purpose, the meaning of life, the afterlife, why bad things happen to good people, and so on, are highly seductive, emotionally appealing, and intuitively convincing, in most cases, leading directly to a belief in God. It is therefore more than a little foolhardy to think that human nature can ever be cured of God by scientific reason. As a way of thinking, God is an inherent part of our natural cognitive systems, and ridding ourselves of him, really thoroughly, permanently removing him from our heads, would require a neurosurgeon, not a science teacher. The belief instinct may never be completely deprogrammed in our animal brains, but by understanding it for what it is, rather than subscribing uncritically to the intuitions it generates, we can distance ourselves from an adaptive system that was designed ultimately to keep us hobbled in fear. But what happens now that we know the truth about God, about our souls, about the afterlife? Whether shattering the adaptive illusion of God is a good thing or a bad thing isn't entirely clear. That value judgment would almost certainly differ from person to person. We are the first generation in the history of our species to be confronted directly by the full scientific weight of an argument that renders a personal God both unnecessary and highly unlikely. 4 lines now from me, summarizing and describing. The author, Baring, spends 2 paragraphs and a whole page contrasting Pascal's wager with Baring's wager, this author's, concluding that the believer has considerably more to lose. He then describes looking out his study window over an old Irish parishioner's graveyard. Now back to his words. The most beautiful woman in the village is somewhere under those dreary stones, too, still wearing the same expensive silk and lace gown sent to her by a wealthy suitor she met while holidaying in Bath 100 years ago. But were we to disturb the earth and peel back the lid on her antique casket, no trace would remain of her lovely face or her voluptuous breasts, nor would we find any sign of the tuberculosis-riddled lungs beneath those breasts that stole her away from so many hopeful young men. It is not these people's bodies that are buried 6 feet underneath the Irish soil. They didn't occupy their bodies or lease them out from God for a short time that they were here. They were their bodies. The difference between our skeletal predecessors and us, however, is that we can actually arrive at a reasonably informed answer. It is an answer that was unobtainable in their day. What's it all for? In the end, that's probably a false riddle. What you choose to do with your brief subjective existence is entirely up to you. If you choose to ignore this precautionary tale of a fleeting life without supernatural consequences, there will be no hell to pay, only missed opportunities, and then you die. And that's the truth, I swear to God.
What a fantastic reading. Thank you so much, Doug. Very, very humanistic theme to that. It is now my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today's session. We welcome her back for the third part of a lecture series on the neurobiological tour of religion and religious phenomenon. She's an associate lecturer in the psychology department at California State University, Sacramento. She received her PhD in behavioral neuroscience from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She has been lecturing about religion and neuroscience since 2010, beginning with community groups in California and Nevada. In 2019, she created a psychology of religion course for Sacramento State. And in 2022, she traveled to Finland for 10 weeks to teach the course and also guest lectured for 1 week in Sweden. Her first 2 lectures to HGP this year were on January 12th and May 25th. Those presentations were on the evolution of religion and the neurobiology of religious experiences. In this third presentation, she will focus on the neurobiology of morality. Until recently, morality and religion have been closely linked. From well before the time of the ancient Greek philosophers, religion has guided our moral judgments. Contemporary moral psychologists provide compelling evidence that humans, whether male or female, atheist or religious, American or Aboriginal, make remarkably similar moral judgments. So if religion doesn't guide our moral judgments, what does? Our speaker will present data from human and non-human studies showing that the frontal and temporal lobes form a network that is active during moral judgments. This data supports the compelling case that, like physical and behavioral traits, morality is influenced by evolutionary mechanisms. These findings challenge our assumptions about morality and encourage us to re-examine ethics, law, and human conflict through the lens of evolution and neuroscience rather than belief. It promises to be a highly stimulating presentation, so please join me in giving a big HGP welcome to Sarah Strand.
All right. Yes, I'm so delighted to return to speak to you all for the third time this year. That was a great introduction on what we discussed back in January and in May. I will add that in January, when we were talking about evolution, I was proposing this idea that is very consistent with the reading, that we have certain characteristics of our cognitive system that sort of defaults us to a type of teleological thinking where we see agents at work in the world, especially to explain things that we don't understand. And then when I came back in May and I was talking about the neurobiology of religious experiences, one of the central ideas of that talk was that not only do we have cognitive systems, but we actually have some neuroanatomy that when these areas of our brain are active, we experience something called a sensed presence, and we feel this sort of weightlessness as we sort of lift outside of our bodies, which in ancient humanity, if we were experiencing those things, it seems to make sense that we might explain those things with attributing them to some kind of higher power. So this is the first talk today, this neurobiology of morality, where instead of saying, okay, it sort of makes sense that we might experience these things this way or think about things this way, this is sort of the first time that I'm going to be saying, you know, people give a lot of credit to religion for the basis of our morality, and there's very little evidence to support that supposition. And yet it continues to be just deeply entwined in the language that we use to discuss moral behavior and moral decision making, and then therefore influencing to some extent, you know, laws and codes of conduct that we support. So this is this third and final talk is really kind of where I think we're going to divulge from sort of the central tenet that I've been trying to explain in the first two talks, that while it might make sense that we have some neuroanatomy and we have some cognitive systems that make sense that we might default to some of those belief behaviors and belief tendencies, when it comes to this very sticky topic of morality, there isn't a lot of evidence from my surveying of the literature and other experts of the literature to support that idea. So you'll see in the very middle there, the neurobiology of moral judgments. That's going to be kind of the meat of our talk. That's why the title of the talk is Neurobiology of Morality. But in order to get us there, I want to introduce some principles of moral justification. I'm going to talk a little bit about the trolley problem, which some of you might have some awareness of already. And then to wrap up the conversation about neurobiology, I do want to take a little bit of a detour into evolution before I do my overall conclusions. So I'm going to jump right in because there's a lot to this talk and I've been running over the last two times, and I'm going to try really hard to finish on time. I have this diagram up here because I think there are times in which people use morality and ethics interchangeably. And I want to make really clear that this talk is going to be more about morality. So those are going to be the things that you see in that sort of yellow circle on the right, where our moral judgments and our moral thinking tend to align more closely with our personal principles and very rarely change, which is in contrast to ethics, which describes more of those external rules, laws, policies that do adjust, do shift, do adapt to different environments. Now, the thing they have in common, which is probably why they are used interchangeably, is that both of them are used to identify conduct, behavior that is right and wrong. So just want to underscore that this talk today is going to focus more on those personal principles that tend to rarely change. They can absolutely influence ethics and influence laws, but the research that I'm going to present is going to be more focused on morality. Okay, now, to introduce this idea of the intersection between morality and religion, I want to sort of state what I think we all probably think is obvious, that morality and religion have been inseparable until very recently. When we talk about contemporary moral scientists, moral psychologists, the studies that have been conducted have only very recently started to sort of tease those two things apart. And yet, even now, when we talk about moral judgments, when we talk about moral behaviors, this vocabulary is still very deeply infused with that connection to religion. I have this quote, this little snippet from a speech that Ronald Reagan gave back in 1984 to the Ecumenical Prayer Breakfast. The snippet of that talks, he said, "The truth is, politics and morality are inseparable. And as morality's foundation is religion, religion and politics are necessarily related. We need religion as a guide. We need it because we are imperfect. Now, I could probably do a whole talk just on sort of, disentangling all of the assumptions that are, being implicitly stated in that quote. The fact that our politics necessarily needs to include religion because we are imperfect and we need a guide completely contradicts what our founders intended. Who spent a great deal of energy maintaining that there should be separation between church and state. It's safe to say that they did not think it was necessary for church to be involved in governing. That was also moral. But we certainly are seeing evidence of this assumption that these two, or rather three principles, are very deeply entwined. So this is still something that is very important and contemporary, and something that we are faced with every single day. So I want to kind of dive into this and tease this apart a little bit. So now I'm going to get into introducing these three principles of moral justification. In order for us to really talk about the neurobiology of moral decision making and even the evolution of morality, I want to make sure that we're on the same page about how exactly these kinds of moral judgments are assessed in the literature. Because, when we start talking about moral behavior, when we start talking about moral judgments, we could probably all brainstorm different ways in which those judgments and those behaviors could be measured and observed. And so it's important for scientists who are studying these concepts and these ideas to kind of get on the same page about what exactly they're going to be using as their dependent variable. What is it they're measuring? And so part of this question about studying moral decision making is to identify that there are basically two different ways that we make decisions, not just moral decisions, but decisions in general. We have this sort of unconscious emotional intuition. Those kinds of decisions and judgments are made very fast. We tend not to really spend a lot of time thinking and processing them. We just it's sort of like we are listening to our gut. They're very involuntary. And oftentimes, where you see that word implicit, sometimes we don't know why we are making those decisions, why our gut is telling us to do that specific thing or make that specific decision. But there's another system that's a bit more conscious. This is a slower system that takes the time to deliberate, weigh different pieces of evidence, perhaps identify rules that need to be followed or should be followed, and that can be very explicitly described, explained, and justified. So we all have these two different ways that we make decisions, and they both have their pros and cons. They both have their benefits and their drawbacks. But one of the important things as I go into not only describing these three principles of moral justification that I'm about to get into, but the study that I'm going to focus on tries to tease apart these two systems as we are learning about how people make moral judgments. Okay? And this is also important because most research in moral psychology has focused on the content of a moral judgment. In other words, is this particular scenario morally permissible or allowable, or is this scenario morally impermissible or forbidden, essentially? So the content of the choice rather than why that choice was made or the source of that moral judgment. And so the source would be one of these two systems. Is it more implicit or is it more reasoned in nature? So that's what this next study that I'm going to talk about is going to display. But before we get there, I want to make sure we're all on the same page about the way in which these three principles of moral justification have been examined in the literature. The trolley problem was first introduced by Philippa Foot in 1967 in a paper that she published in the Oxford Review. But the experimental kind of scenario-based presenting, different stories to participants and having them make moral judgments, that, which we commonly know of today as the trolley problem, was first introduced by Judith Thomson. And there are lots of different ways in which these different scenarios and situations are presented to participants. I'm going to show you 3 of those ways, but there are lots of different ways and lots of different additional pieces of information that we could introduce the more complicated we want to get. But just by introducing these 3 scenarios, I can go ahead and talk about these 3 principles of moral justification, which are the action principle, the intention principle, and the contact principle. Now I've added Mark Hauser onto the screen right now because he and his research team devised this online website where data from hundreds of thousands of people from all over the world, of all walks of life, of different religions, of different socioeconomic statuses, et cetera, were exposed to these different scenarios and made their moral judgments. And this is how we know that that basically humans tend to make very similar moral judgments. So let me just walk you through these 3 different scenarios. We've got the switch problem that's there on the left. And the switch problem, and I should say that in every single one of these situations, doing nothing results in 5 people dying, and doing something results in 1 person dying. So that is exactly the same across all of these scenarios. Doing nothing results in 5 people dying, and doing something, some kind of action, results in 1 person dying. So all of these are weighing, do I kill 1 person or do I kill 5 people? Okay. Now on the switch problem, we've got, a large bus, a trolley, a train, something like that, barreling down the tracks where there are 5 people standing or 5 people working or 5 people in the way, basically, and they don't see this train coming. This person here, this bystander, has the option to pull this switch. And if they do pull the switch, then the train is going to go on to this side track where there happens to be 1 person walking across the track. Now, if that person does nothing, then that train is going to continue straight and hit all 5 of those people and kill all 5 of those people. But if the person makes a response and pulls that lever, diverts that train onto that sidetrack, then only 1 person will be killed, but that person who's on that sidetrack will absolutely be killed. When scenarios such as this are presented to people, about 90% of participants decide to pull the lever. Okay, so overwhelmingly, people agree that pulling that lever is more morally permissible than doing nothing at all. Now, this illustrates the action principle, which states that it's more permissible to redirect an existing threat than to introduce a new threat. So this threat is there. It is going to happen. If, this person does nothing, 5 people are going to die, but they can redirect that existing threat and save more people by unfortunately killing that 1 person who happens to be on that sidetrack. Okay, so that's the action principle, that it's more morally permissible to redirect an existing threat than to introduce a new threat. Harm caused by action is morally worse than equivalent harm caused by omission. I'm going to hop all the way over to the other side now and talk about the footbridge problem. The footbridge problem also has that trolley, that train, that big bus barreling down a track, but there's only 1 this time. And if nothing happens, then this train is going to hit those 5 people. But this person standing on this footbridge, this bridge that's across the track, has the option to physically push a very large person off of that bridge in front of the train, and presumably that person is large enough that the train will stop once that person is hit, saving those 5 people. So again, doing nothing and allowing that train to barrel down the track will kill those 5 people that are on the track, but performing an action, pushing that person off of the footbridge, will kill that 1 person, but will save those other 5. Now, when this scenario is presented to folks, only 10%, I'm going to there you go. Only 10% of people will perform that action and push that person off of the footbridge. So whereas 90% will take the action in the switch problem, only 10% of people will take the action in the push problem. Now, this illustrates the contact principle, which states that it's less permissible to cause harm via direct physical contact than it is by an indirect means. So if you actually have to be physically responsible for touching and physically contacting a person in order to save those 5 people, that's a much less acceptable form of action. Yes, 5 people will die, same as the first problem, but it's seen as much less permissible to actually take that action and cause direct physical contact in order to save those 5 people. And again, only 10% of people will actually take that action, which means 90% of people are saying, no, I don't want to do that. I can't do that. That's not morally permissible. So in these two situations, people make remarkably similar moral judgments about what is and is not permissible, even though in both situations, taking an action will save the 5 people and only kill 1, and not taking that action will kill those 5 people. So then we've got the loop problem. And the loop problem is slightly different than the first two. We do have this train barreling down the track, and if nothing happens, these 5 people will be killed. And what's different about the loop problem compared to the switch problem is that pulling this lever will divert the train onto this side track, but it actually loops back to the main track, okay? So it's not like the switch problem where the train gets diverted onto that second track and then it runs parallel to the first one. In the switch problem, that loop or that side track never goes back to the main track. But in the loop problem, it does go back to the main track. So if this person pulls the lever and there's 5 people on the track, then this train will eventually go back to the main track and kill those 5 people, even if the lever is pulled. So the difference then between the switch problem and the loop problem is that when this person pulls that lever, the reason why they're doing that is because there's a person here on the track, which will stop the train. So it's sort of this combination between the switch and the footbridge, where you are actually intending to use a person's body to stop that train, just like on the footbridge, but you're doing it in an indirect means by pulling that lever, okay? And the only reason why this works to save these 5 people is because that person is there. Whereas in the switch problem, the 5 people are saved when the lever is pulled, and this person just happens to be caught in the crossfire, basically, because they just happen to be on that side track. Okay, so when this problem is presented to folks, only 50% want to pull that lever. It's a lot less clear whether it's morally permissible to pull that lever. I mean, yes, if you pull it, only 1 person dies and 5 people live, but it's sort of this kind of uncomfortable closeness to that contact principle, not because you are physically touching the person, but because the only reason why that train is stopping is because that person is on the track. Now, what's interesting, and this is called the intention principle, which states that it's less permissible to intend to cause harm than to cause harm by a foreseeable side effect. Okay, so 50%, the part of the reason why this is more challenging for people to decide is because pulling that lever is saving 5 people because that one body is on that sidetrack. So you're essentially intending to cause harm. But what's interesting is that when you add to the scenario that there is a gigantic rock on that side track that will stop the train if you pull the lever, and this time that person just happens to be in front of the rock, then you get an increase, and 75% of people are going to go ahead and pull that lever. So not quite the 90, but you still get a lot more agreement about whether it's permissible to pull that lever if there's a big rock there, and that rock is the reason why the train stops, and you just happen to be killing that one person who's walking in front of the rock. Okay? So we've got these three principles of moral justification. You've got the action principle, the contact principle, and then the intention principle. And hopefully another thing that's really clear here from these data from Mark Hauser is that people tend to be in pretty high agreement in both the action principle and the contact principle. But the intention principle is a little bit more wiggly. It's a little bit stickier. It's a little less clear about what the right decision is. And so the intention principle is what I want to focus a little bit more on when we get to the neurobiology of morality in the second part of the talk today. But I promised you that I was going to talk to you not just about the content of the decision. In other words, do they pull the lever? Do they push the person? Or do they not pull the lever or push the person? That we were going to talk about why people make those decisions. Is it because of intuitive reasoning? Is it because of more deliberate, rule-based, kind of thoughtful weighing the evidence reasoning? And so this study, so here's the moral sense test that is online. You can actually access yourself if you're interested. Go ahead and take a screenshot or write this website down if you'd like to participate. But the moral sense test delivers a variety of these different scenarios. And you get to log whether or not you think, yes, it's morally permissible to take the action, or no, it's not morally permissible. But in this particular study that was conducted by Cushman and colleagues, not only did they log the decision, but they also asked people to explain why they made the decision that they made. And the decisions were categorized into each of these different attributes. We've got sufficiency, failure, uncertainty, denial, and alternative explanation. And the way this was coded is that people would explain why they made the decision that they made, and then qualitatively afterwards, the scientists reviewed their rationales, reviewed their justifications, and labeled them into these 5 mutually exclusive rationales. So just really briefly, sufficiency, in order for a reason, an explanation to be coded as sufficiency, the subject had to mention a factual difference between the sort of cases that they were comparing and either claim or imply that it was on the basis of these factual differences in these scenarios that led them to make their decision. Failure meant that the subject suggested some alternative principle, but this alternative could not account for the actual pattern of judgments that the person was making. So their reason and their actual judgment, they were not consistent with one another. Uncertainty was when the subject explicitly referenced his or her own uncertainty about how to justify that scenario, or directly stated that they could not justify their responses. Denial happened when the subject stated that at the point of justification, he or she did not consider there to be any moral difference between the two scenarios. They just had to pick something, and so they picked something. And then an alternative explanation, it was coded when the subject appealed to something that was either invoking facts that weren't presented in the scenario, or claiming that they'd made a mistake in selecting the appropriate response and clicked the wrong button and actually meant to choose something else. Okay, so we've got these 5 different codes to categorize why people justified the specific decisions that they made. And so when we look at the action principle, the intention principle, and the contact principle, we can see that in that action principle, where, for example, you pull a lever and you save 5 people and kill 1 person, 79% of participants are able to sufficiently justify the decision that they made with some facts or something that was relevant to the specific scenario. This suggests that if they can accurately justify why they chose what they chose, that they are using more conscious, deliberate, slow processing reasoning skills. And so I've got a picture there of, the frontal lobe highlighted, which is, kind of where we sort of think about and rationalize the decisions that we make. And you can see that there are very few subjects that were coded as either failure, uncertainty, denial, or some alternative explanation when it came to that action principle, when it came to the pulling the lever in that first example. If we go to the intention principle, the one where it was a lot easier for people to pull the lever if there was a big rock on the railroad track, so that the person wasn't pulling the lever with the intention of killing that one person. The person was pulling the lever because there was a big rock there and the person just happened to be in the way. We see a lot more variability in the ways in which people justified whether or not they were going to pull that lever. Remember that initially only 50% of the people would pull the lever, and it's going to be a little bit more challenging to explain why you would or wouldn't pull the lever. On the one hand, you kill 1 versus 5. On the other hand, the only reason why you save those 5 people is because you intend to kill that one person, right? So there's a lot less clear rationale for why people are choosing the decision that they make. So it seems that perhaps this is more made with that intuition, that sort of quick kind of knee-jerk kind of gut reaction kind of decision making. And then when we look at the contact principle, we can see that there are similarities in the proportion of participants that coded their justifications with either sufficiency, failure, or uncertainty, suggesting that perhaps these are more deliberative, kind of slow, rule-based decisions that are being made. But we also see that there's some similarity in the sort of quick, knee-jerk, kind of gut-based rationale for making those decisions as well, which suggests that even though there's large consistency, that overwhelmingly people choose not to make contact and push the person off the footbridge, that there could be a combination of both rational decision making and more intuitive based decision making happening with these different moral judgments. So this is the end of this section, and I want you to kind of what I want you to kind of anchor from this section as we move forward are a couple of things. One, that people of all walks of life, different beliefs, different genders, different geographic locations, different income levels, different education levels, different socioeconomic statuses, make very similar moral judgments when presented with these different scenarios. And two, that the rationales that are used for these different justifications is a combination and very kind of dependent on the type of moral judgment that's being made, is a combination of both that sort of slow, deliberative, reasoning, rule-based decision-making system and the sort of quicker, knee-jerk kind of gut-based decision-making system. And then there are even some moral judgments that seem to be a combination of the two. Okay, so hopefully you're with me on that. I know I'm going fast. There's a lot to get through, and keep track of your questions, and I'm happy to go back to anything and answer questions at the end. Okay. So now that we've sort of established that we've got these 3 principles of moral justification, and that there's a remarkable similarity in how people of different walks of life make those decisions, and also that it seems to be some combination of both very deliberative and more intuition-based decision-making processes, we can start to talk a little bit about what the neurobiology is of what's happening here. Now I'm going to bring back our old friend from May, the right temporal parietal junction, also called the angular gyrus. We talked previously that theory of mind is the ability to attribute mental states, beliefs, intentions, desires, pretending, knowledge, etc., to oneself and to others, and to understand that others have their own beliefs, desires, intentions, and perspectives that are different from our own. And so when we are interacting with other people and we are trying to assess their beliefs, their desires, their intentions, their motivations, this specific part of the brain is being activated. And we learned from the neurobiology talk in May that this lies in the region between the temporal and parietal lobes, and specifically the right side angular gyrus, when activated, produces that sensed presence phenomenon that we saw in that video with Michael Persinger. And if you weren't here in May, I apologize for sort of shorthanding that explanation. I encourage you to go to the HGP YouTube channel and check out that video. So one of the things that we want to talk about, since there does seem to be a great consistency when participants are evaluating scenarios based on the action principle and scenarios based on the contact principle, but there seems to be less agreement, less clear rationales and decision making for the intention principle. It's the intention principle that I want to focus a little bit on when we get to questions about moral judgments. We talked about how that this particular part of the brain is not activated when thinking about other types of social information. We talked about how the angular gyrus, this right temporal parietal junction, is activated when thinking about beliefs and intents and desires, etc. It's activated when thinking about those intention-based, motivation-based pieces of information, but not all types of social information. You know, not the physical appearance of others or whether or not someone looks hungry or tired or anything like that. It really does seem to be most active when thinking about those intentions, those motivations. So the question then we could ask is, how is that intention and the consequence, which we are evaluating when we're making those moral judgments, how are those two things represented in the brain? How is the brain, specifically this area, the angular gyrus, aka the temporoparietal junction, responding when we are making these moral judgments that are harder for us to justify? Because you remember from that graph, it was the intention principle where the participants were sort of spread across all of those 5 different categories of justifications. So there's this amazing TED Talk, an amazing researcher at Boston University, Leon Young, who's done some really wonderful research in this area. I highly recommend you watch this whole talk. I'm going to go ahead and pull a couple of details from her talk and from her published papers. Her sort of scenarios are focused on these 2 children who are having tea together. And you can see that, you know, one of them has sort of nefarious intentions and one of them has sort of neutral intentions. In both of these situations, harm results. In the first one, where the person, this little girl, is intending to put poison into her friend's tea, in this one, or I'm sorry, harm doesn't result in both of them. But in this one, she intends to harm, but harm doesn't happen. And in this one, she does not intend to harm, but harm happens. So what we're going to do is sort of from here on out work with this kind of 2x2 matrix where we have either neutral beliefs or negative, sorry, I'm gesturing on the wrong slide, neutral beliefs or negative beliefs. In other words, Grace thinks the powder is sugar, that's the neutral belief, or Grace thinks the powder is toxic, that's the negative belief. And then we also have negative outcomes and neutral outcomes. So in the negative belief, Grace thinks the powder is toxic and it actually is toxic, so her friend dies. But in the neutral outcome, where there is a negative belief, Grace thinks the powder is toxic, but it's actually sugar, and so her friend is fine. Now I've got these squares labeled sort of backwards because on the next slide where I show you the data are set up where the first column is a neutral belief and a neutral outcome. Grace thinks the powder is sugar, it's sugar, her friend is fine. The next column is the negative belief with neutral outcome, which is the one pictured here. The third column is the neutral belief with the negative outcome, which is the one pictured here. And then the last column is the negative belief and the negative outcome, where Grace thinks the powder is toxic, it is toxic, and her friend dies. Okay, so we're focusing in not on the action principle and not on the contact principle, but the intention principle. That's what we want to focus on, especially as we're trying to understand the neurobiology of moral decision making, where that's where people seem to have the hardest time making a decision about what to do and what's morally permissible, but also explaining why they made the decision that they made. And especially when we think about this angular gyrus, this right temporal parietal junction, being really involved in assessing people's motivations and assessing their intentions. Okay? All right. This is usually the point where I stop and ask for questions and clarifications, but I know we like to save those till the end. And it looks like I've got about 20 minutes left, so I'm going to try to get through this as best I can. All right. So again, we want to know which one of these, according to people, is more morally permissible. First, we're going to look at the decisions that they made, the content of their decisions. How do people grade the moral permissibility of these 4 scenarios? Okay, so here's our data. And as I said, we've got our neutral belief and our neutral outcome. We've got our negative belief and neutral outcome. And then we've got our neutral belief but negative outcome. And then we've got our negative belief and negative outcome. So they are kind of labeled A, B, C, or D. And remember that B is the negative belief. Grace thinks it's poison, but it's actually not, so the friend is fine. And C is where the Grace thinks it's sugar, but it's actually some kind of toxic substance, and her friend dies. This first one is an attempted harm, which didn't actually happen. And this second one is an accidental harm, a harm that happened without the person's intention. What we're seeing here on the y-axis is this sort of grade of whether or not something is morally permissible or morally forbidden. So lower numbers here mean that the subjects, the participants, are rating this scenario as more morally forbidden, whereas higher numbers represents that the subjects are representing or categorizing the scenario as more morally permissible. So what you're going to see hopefully right off the bat is that, you know, in the neutral outcome, where there's a neutral belief, that's totally fine, right? The person didn't meant to poison, didn't get poisoned, everything's good. And also in the situation where the person didn't actually intend to poison, but there was an accidental negative outcome, people are grading that as also fairly morally permissible. The intention wasn't to harm, and so the person thought they were putting in sugar, but instead they were putting in poison, and as an unintended harm, this person died. People are voting that as more morally permissible. But when we take a look at a neutral outcome in which the person had a negative intention, this situation labeled B, where the person thought they were putting in poison and it just happened to be sugar, that neutral outcome is rated highly morally forbidden, on par with the person who intended to cause harm and actually did. Okay, so there seems to be a very clear divide here in the 2 areas where harm was caused, that if the person didn't intend to cause harm, that's better. And also a clear divide in the neutral outcome, where if the person intended to cause harm, then that's going to be seen as less morally permissible. Okay, so that's the content of their decisions. But let's take a look at what's happening in the brain when these types of decisions are being made. Okay. The next question is whether or not there is an actual neural signature of that intention. And this graph is a little bit harder to read. You know, we've got these same 2 conflicts essentially in intention and outcome. When the intention and the outcome match up, there doesn't seem to be a heck of a lot of conflict. So if the person intends to cause harm and they do, like clearly that's bad. If the person doesn't intend to cause harm and then doesn't, that's clearly okay. But in this conflict area where the person intends to cause harm and then just doesn't because they put in sugar instead of poison, then there's a conflict there. And also in this situation where the person thinks they're putting in sugar but actually put in something toxic, there's a conflict there between intention and outcome. And so we have this same ranking system here where there's less blame, less, the axes are reversed here, where we've got less blame on the person. So essentially, is it more morally permissible? And then the higher number here is more blame, where it's less morally permissible. And then we have a lower right temporal parietal junction response, in other words, that angular gyrus, a low response on the left, and then a high response on the right. Okay, so what we're seeing is essentially that there's going to be a lot lower response in that area of the brain that is assessing intention when the person intends to cause harm and doesn't actually cause harm. So when a person is intending to cause harm and then doesn't, there's going to be less activation in that area of the brain in which intention is assessed, because the idea is that the outcome was fine. The person ended up being fine, but this person had some nefarious intentions, and so we're going to be a little bit more suspicious of this person. But you'll also see that when the person actually did cause harm, when the person actually died, there's going to be a lot more response from that right temporal parietal junction, because instead of focusing solely on the outcome, the person is looking at the participant in the study is looking at the scenario thinking, well, but the girl didn't mean to. It was an accidental harm. There's a lot more activation in that intention area, even when the outcome is negative compared to when the outcome is neutral. So the idea here is that people who show more activity in that right temporal parietal junction, right, so higher activity here, tend to rate accidental harms as more permissive because they're taking that intention into account. The girl didn't mean to cause harm, it was a complete accident. People who show less activity in this area during these accidental harms, when they rate those accidental harms as less permissive, in other words, placing more emphasis on the fact that harm was caused, they tend to so people who show less activity in that right temporal parietal junction are essentially not taking intention into account. They're placing more emphasis in their moral judgments on what actually happened rather than the intention of that person. So this graph very clearly shows, hopefully you can see this, I shouldn't say very clearly because I know that this is a little bit, the axes are swapped and there's high activity happening on the right-hand side. Hopefully you can see from this that higher activity in this RTPJ is indicative of people weighing the intention separately from the outcome. That even when harm is caused, people who have more activity in their right temporal parietal junction are going to place more emphasis on the intention rather than on the outcome. And Leanne Young went on to just talk about some additional follow-up studies that looked at children with autism, even psychopaths that were in prison for like criminals, but then half of the criminals were like non-psychopaths, maybe armed robbery or something like that, versus psychopaths where serial killers and that kind of thing. When looking at the brains of these two different populations, and I can show that data at the end because I do have it, it's so interesting, but I knew I wasn't going to have time to talk about it. They show different neurobiological profiles when weighing these different intention-based scenarios. So it seems really clear that, at least from a correlational standpoint, right? Correlation is not causation, that the right temporal parietal junction seems to be involved in weighing the intentions of people instead of focusing solely on the outcome. So what Leanne Young did next was say, okay, let's go ahead and really test this theory. Let's go ahead and see if it's actually the RTPJ that is causing people to weigh and evaluate those intentions separately from the actual outcome. And so she did a couple of follow-up studies. Both of them involved transcranial magnetic stimulation. And, here someone is in a machine in which they can, read the scenarios and have their angular gyrus, their RTPJs, be stimulated at some point during that moral judgment. In experiment 1, this transcranial magnetic stimulation was applied for 25 minutes before the moral judgment was made. So the person is in the machine, they're experiencing that transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is pretty similar to what we talked about with the God helmet, right? It's not quite the same, but in terms of the influence on the brain, it's a little similar. And then in the second experiment, instead of applying it for a full 25 minutes, the TMS was applied for half a second right as the person was making the moral judgment. Okay. So essentially, what she wants to know is, does stimulation of the RTPJ or disruption of activity of the RTPJ influence the type of moral judgment that someone is going to make about those intention principles? So I'm going to have experiment 1 up here, and I'm going to have experiment 2 down here. These, the x-axis is similar to what we just looked at with the neutral belief, neutral outcome, negative belief, neutral outcome, the neutral belief, negative outcome, and then the negative belief, negative outcome. And then the axis here is again flipped from what it was on the previous slide, where more morally permissible is at the top and less morally permissible is at the bottom. Okay. And so there's a lot that's happening in this graph, and I'm going to blow this up a little bit so we can sort of look at this a little bit better. Here's what I want you to focus on when you're looking at these graphs. In each of those 4 scenarios, we see very little difference, no statistically significant difference, when some other area of the brain was being stimulated with transcranial magnetic stimulation. That's what the control TMS is, that there's some stimulation happening someplace other than the RTPJ, and then compared to the stimulation of the RTPJ for that 25 minutes before the moral judgment is being made, there's no statistically significant difference between any of these categories except for the one in which harm was intended and there was a neutral outcome. That's the only one in which there is a statistically significant difference between these two. In all of the others, the neutral intention, the neutral outcome, the neutral intention, the negative outcome, the negative intention and negative outcome, the TMS did not make a difference. There's more moral permissibility in the neutral intention, neutral outcome, as well as the neutral intention, negative outcome. And there's less moral permissibility in the negative intention, negative outcome. And then there is a difference in terms of the moral permissibility when someone intends to cause harm, but didn't actually cause harm. In the control stimulation, that's rated as less morally permissible, on par with the negative intention, negative outcome. But during that stimulation of the transcranial magnet or of the RTPJ, those subjects are going to rate that action of the intended harm, but the neutral outcome as being a little bit more morally permissible. Maybe that's not so bad. But only when that RTPJ was being stimulated with transcranial magnetic stimulation. When we look at the second experiment, in which instead of the 25 minutes of our TMS before the decision was made, it was made right at the moment, for that half second, right at the moment the decision was being made, we see the exact same results. Again, no difference between the control TMS and the RTPJ TMS in the neutral belief neutral outcome, neutral belief negative outcome, and negative outcome negative or negative belief negative outcome, but a statistically significant difference when there is a negative belief and a neutral outcome, where when that RTPJ is being stimulated, those participants rate it as statistically significantly more morally permissible. So what does this tell us? That interfering with activity in the RTPJ disrupts our capacity to use mental states in moral judgments. That intention principle, where it's already hard for us to figure out what we should do in terms of whether to rate it as morally permissible or not, or to take the action or not, when it's already challenging for us to describe why we made the decision we make, when we are unable to use our RTPJ, or unable is probably the wrong word, because some people, there's individual variability in the degree to which the RTPJ is active when making those judgments. But when the RTPJ is being stimulated, participants tend to take intentions into account significantly less and focus more on the outcome of what happened. And so since this situation, the outcome was neutral, the person was fine, the participants that were receiving TMS to their RTPJ ended up rating those as more morally permissible, okay? So not only is there a correlational relationship between those moral judgments and the RTPJ, this study shows that the RTPJ is implicated in causing us to weigh intentions in our moral judgments. Now, there's a lot more that we could talk about in terms of the neurobiology of moral decision making. It's not all about the RTPJ. Research also shows that there's decreased activity in the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, as well as moral judgments being compromised in either complete or partial colostomies, when the corpus callosum is cut in half, that led to ratings of those attempted harms as being more morally permissible. So there seem to be those three areas. In addition, when we look at activity in the orbital frontal cortex, these connections, there are projections from the amygdala to the OFC that have led neuroscientists and moral psychologists to conclude that making the right moral judgments feels good. Like, it makes us feel good when we feel like we're making good moral judgments. And this feeling good has some implications in terms of the evolutionary aspect of moral decision making. So like I said, that middle chunk there is sort of the guts of this presentation, where we're talking about different areas of the brain that are active when we are evaluating whether certain scenarios are more or less morally permissible, and highlights the important aspect of intention when we are deciding whether or not something is or isn't morally permissible. But that really is more of a contemporary view. And what I want to do to kind of close this out, it looks like I've got about 15 minutes or so. Correct me if I'm wrong, but what I want to do to close this out is actually zoom back out again. In my animal behavior class, I talk a lot about explaining behavior from a proximate perspective, and that's what we just did. We looked at neuroanatomy, neurobiology, neurophysiology to understand why someone in a particular situation is doing what they're doing. But I also talk about explaining behavior from an ultimate perspective, where we kind of zoom out and we take a look at evolution, and we also take a look at sort of phylogenetic relationships. In other words, similar related species, and evaluating whether they too are responding similarly in different situations. So I want to do just a little brief stint, zooming back out again and talking about evolution.
Sarah?
Yes.
So normally we would be in Q&A about 8 minutes ago.
Oh, my apologies.
There was a misunderstanding, maybe.
Yeah, I thought I had till 11:20. So I can very briefly go over this and take maybe 2 or 3 minutes to just do that and then stop. Does that sound good?
Yes. Thanks.
Okay, sounds good. No worries. So the main point of this evolutionary section of the talk is to sort of suggest that the evolutionary origins of morality are rooted in the fact that humans are a gregarious species. And I'm going to specifically point out here that groups of altruists are going to be more fit than groups of non-altruists. And there's this beautiful study that was done with human infants, where even children as young as 6 months old are able to identify and reward an inanimate sort of actor who is helping, and then punish an inanimate actor that is harming or hurting, and show preferences, reward, and also favor individuals who also favor prosocial actors and punish other actors that are favoring the antisocial actors. This beautiful study that was conducted there. Taking a more phylogenetic perspective, when we're looking at related species, we absolutely see evidence of prosocial behavior, helping others, weighing the fairness of actions of others in non-human primates. So I've got an example here in chimpanzees, and then this 4-minute video is going to be an example of capuchins behaving in, if we're going to use an anthropomorphic term, moral ways, behaving toward each other in moral ways, in different prosocial ways.
A pot of hazel.
And so my conclusions then, if we're sort of putting all of this together, when we talk about the right temporal parietal junction, weighing the intentions and motivations and ideas and beliefs of others, but pairing that with its activity in making moral decisions based on intentions, and then zooming out and thinking about the idea that it's not just humans that behave in this way. It's not just humans where altruistic actions benefit the group, that it's our non-human primate relatives as well. I would put forth that our morality comes from our belonging, not from our believing, okay? Morality is still deeply infused with religion. We see evidence of that every day. But when we examine this more closely, we see remarkable similarities among people that have different religions, along with all sorts of other different characteristics. And we also see that social groups incentivize that moral behavior because we are fitter, stronger, better able to pass our genes into the next generation, which is what evolution and natural selection is all about, when social groups are working together and cooperating and forming a cohesive community, than when there are bad actors, when there are individuals that are fighting the cohesive strength of the group. Okay, so hopefully I did that in 2 or 3 minutes. My apologies for misunderstanding the time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sarah. That was a very edifying presentation. I have a bunch of comments that I wanted to make, but I'm going to skip them because we're, as Dave mentioned, we're already 12 minutes into the Q&A.
Yeah.
If you don't know the process, if you're at Friendly House and you have a question for Sarah, please raise your hand to get a number, and you can ask your question when called upon. For those on Zoom who have questions, please type your name into the chat. And when I call your name, please unmute your microphone and ask your question. As Dave mentioned, we're already eating into the time, so please be mindful of time when you ask your questions, and that way we can cycle through as many of them as possible. Shall we go to question 1 at the friendly house?
Yes, thank you. I enjoyed your presentation. Is there any evidence that in these types of survey situations where people are asked to make moral decisions, that should they be put into an actual situation where they have to make a decision like that, that they actually follow the rules that they set for themselves? Or is it because when we're placed in moral situations, we often feel, or dangerous situations, that we have to act quickly? We don't have time to think.
That's a great question. I am not familiar with research in which, instead of reading scenarios and making decisions, people are put into a situation. Of course, this was dramatized in The Good Place, right? Did you ever watch The Good Place?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was that actually did happen, and with some disastrous effects. You're right that when we are face to face with these decisions, that the decisions that people make might, bring their own mortality into mind, might be weighing young versus old, relatives versus non-relatives, friends, familiars versus, acquaintances and unfamiliars. That there's all sorts of different ways in which we can change the mechanics of these situations to influence the decisions that people make. But I think what would happen if someone was actually in that situation and having to make the decision for themselves is that it would become less about morality as a concept, like a broad concept, and more about what's happening in that individual moment. And that might add some variability that would be harder to explain. But it doesn't mean that it wouldn't be interesting. So it's a great idea.
That your diagram showing the right parietal junction is actually showing the left parietal junction. You're showing the left side of the brain, not the right side.
My apologies.
On your big diagram.
My apologies.
Let's take a question from Zoom. Jules, do you want to unmute the microphone and go ahead?
Oh, wonderful talk. You do hear me, correct? Can you hear me?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, we can hear you, Jules.
Okay. So my thinking is, if we insert in the moral judgment trolley scenario age as a factor, if the one individual who is going to get killed, either one, is at the prime of their life, they're in their 20s or 30s, while the other 5 are 60 years of age or older, would that completely skew that decision trolley story? I mean, it's conjecture, but what's your sense of that?
Yeah, you'd get a lot more variability for sure. Yeah, I don't think it would be nearly as clear cut as 90% and 10%. Yeah, the more you start adding kind of those details in there, you start to figure out what is and isn't important to people. It's the same thing when you do like the survival questions, the canoe out in the middle of the ocean, and you only have a certain amount of food. Who do you toss overboard? A lot of people weigh age, potential, that kind of thing into the decisions that they make. So what we try to do is kind of pare it down to its most pure, like killing 1 versus killing 5, like nothing else about the situation. Yeah, but it absolutely does influence. Yeah.
Thanks for that, Jules. Let's take question number 2 at the friendly house.
I hope this hasn't been covered before, but do you have a reading list for this? I
do. Yeah, I do. I'm happy to forward it to my contacts at HGP if you'd like. The slides had citations on them, so I'm happy to share those references.
That'd be very helpful, Sarah. Let's take question 3 at the friendly house.
Yeah. So, whoops, she disappeared.
Oh, she's still there.
She's still there.
Okay. So the discussion of altruism, was in terms of, profit and benefit, which is sort of not like true altruism in some sense. It reminded me a little bit of kind of Ayn Rand and the virtue of selfishness and that kind of thing. So I was wondering, and even if you think about people who seemingly do really truly altruistic things, often they think they're going to heaven, right? There's some kind of reward or profit. So is there evidence that there's much human activity that has to be explained in terms of like without helping others without any possible explanation of profit or benefit or value of it?
Yeah, the point you raised that there really are no true altruistic actions because typically our actions are going to benefit us in some way, shape, or form. I think that's sort of the central premise of what you're asking, right?
Might give up something on a personal level. I think you were
Yeah,
saying on an individualistic level, but you
yeah.
get the benefits of belonging to a group.
Yeah, yeah, because when you have one individual who is acting selfishly in a group of people that are acting altruistically, or sorry, reversed. When you have one altruistic person in a group of sort of selfish people, then that altruistic person who is, giving of themselves and being generous and trying to help others and not getting a heck of a lot back and sort of, the takers rather than the givers, then that altruistic person is actually not going to be super fit in that environment. But when we're talking about evolution of morality from a group fitness perspective, we're sort of saying the group as a whole is helpful to one another. That when that group as a whole is helpful to one another, the group is elevated. The group does succeed better when compared to groups of people that don't help each other, that are more individualistic in nature. So we're sort of taking out the actions of individuals in that group situation and looking at the group as a whole, if that makes sense.
Excellent. Let's take question number 4 at Friendly House.
I can't seem to get past my reaction that the person whose intentions were nefarious should be rated equally bad whether the other person lives or dies. Is that just my rational brain, or why am I doing that?
No, I mean, that there isn't perfect coherence in terms of, those ratings of moral permissibility. So you're essentially saying that if they intended to kill a person, then they should be rated as more harmful whether they lived or died? Or are you saying the person who accidentally killed the person?
No, not as an accident. The person who intentionally killed the person.
Intended to kill and did kill, or intended to kill and didn't kill?
Intended to kill and did not kill.
Yeah, they were actually rated fairly similarly.
Oh, I thought that person was given more moral permissibility.
When the brains were stimulated, when the angular gyrus, the function of the angular gyrus was disrupted with the transcranial magnetic stimulation, those individuals rated that person, that scenario, as significantly more morally permissible. Not as high as all the others. I mean, it was still lower, but there was a statistically significant difference in the more permissible direction. So it was still low, but yeah, when you don't take the intentions into account and the person ends up being fine, when you aren't using your angular gyrus, you tend to think, maybe that's okay. Yeah, so those data, I had to go through them really quickly, and I apologize. I try to go a little bit slower, and I still went over time, so I apologize for that.
Joyce, for what it's worth, Polly on Zoom says that she agrees that intentions are most important, so you're not alone on thinking that.
Yeah.
Okay. We'll take our second question on Zoom, and it's Willow. Go ahead, Willow.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can.
We can.
Hi, this might be out of the scope of your talk, so feel free to pass if need be. But when I see details like this about sort of the evolutionary explanations of morality, I see a strong argument against creationism, and yet I wonder if you share that view as well, how you might respond to someone saying, look, this more faceted, complex evidence for how morality works and how people treat morality. This is further evidence for guided evolution, or for maybe some sort of design, seeing these workings in the brain around morality.
You're saying that these data support creationism, or these data don't support creationism?
I'm not saying that they do. I'm curious how, if at all, you would respond to people saying that they do. Yeah, and I don't know if that's out of the scope or not. But
I don't think so. I mean, I had to kind of rush through the evolution bit, so I can certainly elaborate a little bit more on sort of why I wanted to include that. Whenever I see evidence in our neurobiology and in our phylogenetic history of behaviors and I guess tendencies, I tend to see that as more evidence for evolution and less evidence for something like creationism. I'm not a proponent of creationism, so I don't know if that's a fair comparison because I'm not sure what it would take in order for me to support creationism. But when I see that phylogenetic evidence, when I see that neurobiological evidence, when I see remarkable consistency across huge swaths of different people with different characteristics, I tend to see that as more a product of our human evolution and characteristics that were beneficial for our survival than of, anything religious or creationist or anything like that.
Excellent. Let's take our fifth question at Friendly House.
I don't know which side this comes down on the side of determinism or free will. I'm wondering if you have anything to say about that.
Yeah, that's a great question for philosophers, and I know that what's the primatologist name from Stanford? I am completely blanking on his name. He's a big proponent of Sapolsky, Robert Sapolsky. He's a big proponent of determinism. I don't know where I come down on that. I guess I'm uncomfortable with the idea of determinism, and I don't think just because we have neurobiology that results in more people or on average people behaving in one way or the other. I feel like that's, again, more product of our environment and how we are adapting and adjusting to our environment and our evolution, rather than a lack of free will. But again, I feel like that's going to be, we're wading into philosophy at this point, and I'm not sure where I land on that.
Let's take our sixth question.
I'm back. You mentioned the angular gyrus as being involved in intention, and if one looks at the various fields of ethics, not morality but ethics, then intention tends to fall more into virtue ethics, whereas the trolley problem dealing with 5 versus 1 tends to be more utilitarian in terms of the ethical principles that are espoused by it. And then there's also deontology, which is basically a rules-based ethics. Is there any evidence, that's probably be very difficult to get, that people who subscribe to different ethical philosophies behave differently under any of the scenarios?
I think that's the beauty of the moral sense test, because there are thousands of different scenarios. I mean, I just picked a couple, but there are thousands of different scenarios that are presented to folks, and folks are making similar, they're sort of coalescing around action in the action principle, they're coalescing around no contact in the contact principle, and then there's a lot more variability in the intention principle. And so I think the comments that have been made about whether or not intentions should or shouldn't be the only thing that matters is a great illustration of the fact that people don't treat intentions or judge intentions in exactly the same way. And as the data from the first paper that I showed, people have a really hard time explaining why they do or don't take intentions into account. So I think whether you're talking about the different moral philosophies, when it comes down to, because you can keep the conversation really vague and general when you're talking about that, But when you solidify into these specific scenarios and say, okay, well, what would you do in this situation? Which is what's happening with the moral sense test website, and also what happens with those, life raft kinds of questions. When you focus it in on specific situations, there doesn't seem to be a lot of variability in the decisions that people make. Now, I will say that I don't think the Hauser studies or the Young studies or the Cushman studies ever asked folks to identify themselves with a specific moral branch of, philosophy. So those data haven't explicitly been collected. But I would imagine that because there's such remarkable consistency across those three principles of moral behavior, that it probably doesn't affect folks' decisions much.
Excellent. It looks like we're out of questions. So once again, let's thank Sarah Strand for a fantastic presentation.